Right now, at the bottom of the ocean in northern Europe, there is a dead zone where nothing can breathe. It is bigger than the entire country of Ireland. And here's the thing that makes no sense. It is not dead because of a toxic chemical spill. It is dead because it has too much food. The exact same fertilizer used to grow farm crops washes off the land and into the water. It triggers massive plant growth. When those plants die and sink, the rotting process eats all the oxygen in the deep water. That kills everything on the sea floor. This is the Baltic Sea, one of the most historic marine crossroads in Europe, and right now it is suffocating. The Baltic Sea sits in northern Europe, surrounded by densely populated nations. For centuries, it connected trade routes and fishing communities. Millions of people live along its shores. Their waste, their farm runoff, and their industrial discharge all funnel into this one body of water. The Baltic is not an open ocean. It is a semi-enclosed basin. Water exchange with the North Sea is severely limited because of narrow passages called the Danish Straits. That means whatever flows in gets trapped. Nutrients stay inside. Pollutants pile up. The sea cannot flush itself clean. What makes the Baltic completely unique is a physical feature that turns it into a death trap. Deep below the surface, there is a heavy layer of dense salt water. This creates what scientists call a stratified water column. Fresh, oxygen-rich surface water sits on top. Heavy, salty water stays at the bottom. The two layers do not mix. That salt layer acts like a lid. It blocks oxygen from reaching the deep. Occasionally, rare inflow events push salt water from the North Sea into the Baltic and temporarily bring oxygen to the depths. But those events are not frequent enough. The deep water stays cut off. And when oxygen cannot reach the bottom, the entire seafloor ecosystem begins to die. Under the hood, the system works like this. Nutrients flow in from rivers, farms, and cities. Those nutrients feed explosive algae blooms at the surface. The algae grow fast, die fast, and sink to the bottom. Bacteria decompose the dead organic matter. That decomposition process burns oxygen. The more algae that sink, the more oxygen gets consumed. Because the salt lid blocks fresh oxygen from entering the deep water, the bacteria eventually use up all the oxygen that is down there. Once the oxygen is gone, the seafloor becomes anoxic. Nothing that needs to breathe can survive. The main causal chain is clear. Decades of constant overnourishment pushed the semi-enclosed sea past its self-cleansing capacity. The result is a vast oxygen depletion that asphyxiates the bottom ecosystem. If you are following this breakdown and you want to see where we cover next, hit subscribe now because we are building a series on collapsing water bodies and the mechanisms that kill them. Each one teaches a different lesson about how ecosystems fail. The first major loss is the seafloor itself. The dead zone is an area where decomposing algae has wiped out all bottom-dwelling life. Maps now visualize these vast anoxic zones spreading year by year. Around 20% of the Baltic Sea's deep seafloor lacks visible life due to low oxygen levels. In these lifeless zones, the seafloor turns black. It emits toxic hydrogen sulfide gas that smells like rotten eggs. In some areas, eerie white mats appear. These are sulfur-eating bacteria. They are the only things that can survive on the mud. Everything else is gone. The second loss happens at the surface. Excess nutrients feed massive, summer-toxic algae blooms. These blooms are so enormous they create bright green swirls visible from orbiting satellites. The surface scum blocks sunlight from reaching the deeper water. That kills seagrass meadows that serve as vital fish nurseries. The blooms also produce toxins. Those toxins can harm marine life. They can make coastal waters dangerous. Dogs that drink the water or lick their fur after swimming in it can die. Beaches get shut down. Tourism collapses. Algae mats frequently close vast stretches of the Polish, Swedish, and Finnish coasts during peak summer. If you want to understand how deep ecosystems work, you need to look at the Baltic cod. This fish is the region's most famous resident. It has been fished commercially for generations. But cod need specific conditions to reproduce. Their eggs must float in oxygenated water to survive. In the Baltic, that means the eggs need to stay suspended in the layer where there is still oxygen. But as the dead zones expand, the oxygenated layer shrinks. Cod eggs sink into the anoxic dead zone. They dissolve before they can hatch. Commercial fish stocks, including Baltic cod, have collapsed in several regions due to oxygen depletion in deep water layers where they depend on spawning habitat. Surviving fish are emaciated, stunted, and parasite-ridden because their entire deep water food web has been wiped out. This system is actively worsened by climate change. Climate change acts as a relentless accelerator. Surface temperatures in parts of the Baltic have risen since 1960. Warmer water absorbs less oxygen than cold water. That reduces the potential for deep water aeration. It increases the likelihood of dead zones. The Baltic is warming, and that warming physically reduces the water's ability to hold oxygen. Even if rare inflow events push North Sea water into the Baltic, the oxygen gets consumed almost instantly because the sea now burns through oxygen faster than it can be replenished. There is another feedback loop that makes everything worse. When oxygen vanishes, seafloor mud releases decades of stored phosphorus back into the water. Phosphorus is a nutrient. It fuels even more algae growth. So the dead zones themselves create more nutrients, which create more algae, which create bigger dead zones. This is a phosphorus time bomb. The system feeds itself. And there is one more twist. Some of the algae blooms are cyanobacteria. These toxic algae have a superpower. They can pull nitrogen directly from the air. That makes them nearly impossible to starve, even if river pollution is cut. As long as phosphorus is available, cyanobacteria will keep blooming. The cascade of consequences is severe. Deep ecosystem collapse leads directly to the bankruptcy of fishing communities. Generational maritime livelihoods disappear. The giant algae mats shut down coastal tourism during peak summer. That sparks fierce political disputes over pollution targets. As fish stocks collapse, the sea is shifting into a gelatinous ecosystem dominated by algae and stress-tolerant jellyfish. The Baltic is transforming from a productive fishing ground into a biological wasteland. Strong winds can suddenly push deep, suffocating water to the surface, causing massive, instant fish kills near popular swimming beaches. Decomposing organic matter in the dead zones creates pockets of methane gas that occasionally bubble up from the lifeless mud. There is also a hidden danger. After World War II, tens of thousands of tons of chemical weapons were dumped on the seafloor. Acidic, oxygen-free water is accelerating the decay of those munitions. The risk of leaks is rising, and because the Danish straits are so narrow, water takes decades to cycle out of the Baltic. Pollutants are trapped inside for generations. Even if all pollution stopped today, it would take half a century for the sea to flush out its current nutrient load. The human price is the permanent loss of generational maritime livelihoods and the transformation of pristine coastlines into hazard zones. Communities that relied on cod fishing for centuries have watched their catches vanish. Commercial catches crashed from hundreds of thousands of tons in the 1980s to virtually zero today, as spawning grounds disappeared. Beaches that once drew tourists are now covered in toxic algae mats. The sea that connected northern Europe for centuries is now a source of disappointment and loss. Despite decades of conservation efforts, progress has been slow. Some improvements have been made. Annual phosphorus inflow has decreased by over 40,000 tons since the 1980s. That is a real reduction, but an additional reduction of 4,500 tons is still required to reverse the eutrophication trend. The problem is that nutrients come from many sources. Runoff from multiple countries funnels the waste and fertilizer of millions of people into this one trapped basin. Massive pig and poultry farms in the drainage basin are now the primary drivers of the nitrogen choking the sea. Industrial manure is overwhelming the system. If this trajectory continues without radical nutrient reduction, the dead zones will persist as a dominant feature of the ecosystem. To know where this is going, you must track specific signals. First, track the physical measurement of the anoxic seafloor area. If it continues to expand, the system is still deteriorating. Second, track satellite chlorophyll levels. These indicate bloom severity. If summer blooms remain massive, the nutrient load is still too high. Third, track the stock status of the eastern Baltic cod as a bioindicator of system health. If cod populations do not recover, the spawning habitat is still destroyed. There is also a missing rescue mechanism. Historically, massive winter storms would push oxygen-rich North Sea water into the Baltic. Those storms acted as a natural reset, but climate change has made those storms increasingly rare. The Baltic is losing its natural ventilation system. The oxygen debt is growing. The sea now consumes oxygen faster than it can be replenished. Rare inflows of fresh ocean water are used up almost instantly. The system is stuck in a downward spiral. Scientists are trialing experimental solutions. Massive mussel farms are being tested to physically suck nitrogen and phosphorus out of the water. The mussels filter the nutrients and can be harvested as animal feed. But these are small-scale experiments. They cannot reverse the damage on their own. The scale of the problem is too large. The only real solution is to cut nutrient input at the source. That means transforming agriculture, upgrading wastewater treatment, and coordinating pollution policy across multiple nations. It is a political and economic challenge as much as an environmental one. Ultimately, the Baltic Sea proves that a body of water can be killed not by a single violent poison, but by the collective nourishment of the nations lining its shores. It is a slow-motion asphyxiation. The sea is suffocating under a blanket of food. The same fertilizer that grows crops on land is destroying the sea floor. The same nutrients that feed farms are feeding toxic algae. And because the Baltic is semi-enclosed and stratified, it cannot escape. The salt lid traps the problem. The narrow straits prevent flushing. The warming climate reduces oxygen capacity. Every mechanism works together to suffocate the deep. This is not a story about a sudden disaster. It is a story about a system slowly overwhelmed by decades of excess. The Baltic was once a thriving crossroads. Now it is a cautionary tale. The dead zone is not shrinking. The algae blooms are not stopping. The cod are not recovering. The seafloor is still black. The water still smells like sulfur. And millions of people who depend on this sea are watching it die. The disappointment is in the gap between what the Baltic was and what it has become. It was a place where fish thrived, where communities prospered, where coastlines were clean. Now it is a place where the seafloor is lifeless, where beaches close in summer, where fishing boats sit empty. The loss is measurable. The loss is visible. The loss is ongoing. Tell us which collapsing water body we should investigate next. Drop a comment below and let us know what you want us to break down. Thanks for watching.